limit for statements during the high-level segment. Statements should be as concise as possible, noting that full text of the official statements will be made available on the UNFCCC website. And finally, please note that heads of state or government who are not in the plenary at the time for delivery of their statements will be rescheduled to speak at the end of all statements of the same category. As part of the hygiene measures to ensure a safe environment of all participants, statements will be delivered from alternate rostrums.
Excellency, you have the floor. So I will speak in German. Maybe you can open your devices to get translation. Herr Präsident, Exzellenzen, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen! Ich hatte die Ehre, im Jahre 1995 als Umweltministerin der Bundesrepublik Deutschland die erste Vertragsstaatenkonferenz zu leiten. Heute hier in Glasgow wird die COP26 die letzte Konferenz sein, bei der ich dabei bin. Und deshalb stellt sich natürlich die Frage, wo stehen wir heute? Wir haben eine Vielzahl von Beschlüssen gefasst, gerade gestern wieder bei den G20 in Rom. Und wir haben vor allen Dingen als unsere Leitmarkierung das Abkommen von Paris aus dem Jahr 2015. Aber, und das haben wir in der Eröffnungssitzung auch schon gehört, wir sind nicht da, wo wir hin müssen. Die von den Vertragsstaaten abgelieferten Reduktionsziele, die NDCs, ergeben zusammen nicht das, was wir in Paris vereinbart haben. Und die Welt hofft natürlich darauf, und ich unterstreiche das, dass wir am Ende dieser Glasgower Konferenz besser dastehen. Da geht es einmal um die verbesserten Ziele, aber es geht vor allen Dingen in den nächsten Tagen auch um die technischen Fragen, wie können wir unsere Ziele verbindlicher messen und damit ein einheitliches Maß auch entwickeln. Dass die Auswirkungen des Klimawandels verheerend sind, wissen wir. Und wir müssen, und ich sage auch, wir können das Pariser Abkommen umsetzen und das nicht erst im Laufe dieses Jahrhunderts, sondern, wie wir als G20 gesagt haben, in der Mitte dieses 21. Jahrhunderts. Wir wissen, dass insbesondere die Industrieländer Verantwortung tragen, und das betrifft natürlich auch die Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Deshalb haben wir unsere Klimaziele noch einmal verschärft. Wir wollen bis 2030 65% unserer Emissionen einsparen gegenüber 1990 und bis 2045 klimaneutral sein. Essentiell für die Glaubwürdigkeit der Industrieländer ist aber auch die Finanzierung. Deutschland und Kanada haben sich unseren Delivery-Plan noch einmal angeschaut. Wir müssen zugeben, dass wir die 100 Milliarden US-Dollar Finanzierung erst 2023 erreichen, aber immerhin verspätet, aber wir können sie erreichen. Das ist ein wichtiges Signal. Wir leisten von deutscher Seite hier einen beträchtlichen Beitrag und werden den bis 2025 auf 6 Milliarden erhöhen. Klimaneutralität zu erreichen, das ist auf der einen Seite die Zielsetzung, aber auf der anderen Seite sind es die konkreten Maßnahmen. Und neben unseren nationalen Anstrengungen versuchen wir natürlich, an verschiedenen Stellen Beiträge zu sein. Mit der Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use stärken wir den Schutz von Wäldern. Und für mich ist wichtig, dass wir bis 2030 den Waldverlust global stoppen. Wir haben eine erfolgreiche Partnerschaft mit Kolumbien, in der wir gemeinsam mit Norwegen und dem Vereinigten Königreich den Schutz der Wälder voranbringen. Deutschland wird Teil einer Initiative sein, von der ich glaube, dass sie besonders interessant ist, nämlich einer Just Energy Transition Partnership mit Südafrika, wo wir zeigen, wie wir aus der Nutzung von Kohle aussteigen können. Und ich glaube, das wird ein Pilotprojekt für viele afrikanische Länder sein, denn die Wahrheit ist natürlich sehr konkret. Und dass wir gestern bei G20 verabredet haben, die internationale Finanzierung von Kohlekraftwerken zu stoppen, und zwar jetzt, ist sehr wichtig. Meine Damen und Herren, wir werden mit staatlichen Aktivitäten alleine nicht vorankommen, sondern es geht um eine umfassende Transformation unseres Lebens, Arbeitens und Wirtschaftens. Und deshalb will ich hier ein klares Plädoyer einlegen für die Bepreisung von Kohlenstoffemissionen, von CO2-Emissionen. Mit einer solchen Bepreisung, die wir in der Europäischen Union schon haben, die in China eingeführt wird und die mit vielen anderen zusammen weltweit entwickelt werden muss, können wir unsere Industrie, unsere Wirtschaft dazu bringen, die technologisch besten und effizientesten Wege finden, um zur Klimaneutralität zu kommen. Und es geht um die Veränderung unseres Wirtschaftens, Arbeitens. Und das ist eine umfassende Transformation. Dann werden wir wissen, wie wir am besten CO2-freie Mobilität, CO2-freie Industrie und CO2-freie Prozesse unseres Lebens arrangieren können. Deshalb mein klares Plädoyer in der Dekade des Handelns, in der Dekade, in der wir jetzt leben, national ambitionierter zu sein, aber global Instrumente zu finden, die nicht nur Steuergelder einsetzen, sondern auch wirtschaftlich vernünftig sind. Und das ist für mich die CO2-Bepreisung. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Abdul Hamid Mohammed Al-Dabaiba, Prime Minister of Libya. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة الحضور الكريم، تحية مسائية طيبة. أود أن أشكر المملكة المتحدة وإيطاليا على جهودهم المبذولة من أجل تنظيم هذه القمة، والتي تظهر مدى قوة التعاون الدولي في التصدي لأحد التحديات المعاصرة التي تواجه العالم. كما أتقدم بشكر خاص لسلطات مدينة غلاسكو على تنظيم هذا الحدث العظيم العالمي. ولا يفوتني أن أشيد بحركة وبحرص المملكة المتحدة على اتخاذ الإجراءات الوقائية اللازمة لضمان سلامة الوفود المشتركة في هذه القمة. قادة العالم المشاركين في هذه القمة، أشكركم وأحييكم على دوركم تجاه قضية تغيير المناخ التي أثبتت المؤشرات والإحصائيات بأنها تشكل تهديداً كبيراً على كوكبنا. سيد الرئيس، الإخوة الحاضرين، بعد تولي حكومة الوحدة الوطنية لمهامها قامت باستحداث وزارة تعني بقضايا البيئة، وشكلت لجنة وطنية للتغيير المناخي، وتمت المصادقة مؤخراً على اتفاقية باريس لتغيير المناخ إيماناً منا بأهمية هذا الملف، وإن مساهمة الدول المتضررة ومنها بلادي في المحصلة العالمية لتراكم غازات الاحتباس الحراري يعد ضئيلاً جداً مقارنة بمستوى الانبعاثات الناجمة عن الحركة الصناعية في الدول المتقدمة، مما يدفع بعض الدول للعمل خارج المنظومة الدولية ورفض إجراءات التكييف مع التغييرات المناخية. وإننا من هذا المنبر ندعو الدول الكبرى المشاركة في هذه القمة إلى الوفاء بوعودها التي اتخذتها في مؤتمرات سابقة، واتخاذ إجراءات تنفيذية من خلال دفع المساهمات التي وعدت بها لصالح الدول النامية من أجل المساهمة في البنية التحتية ونشر التقنية التي تسهم في إنتاج طاقة صديقة للبيئة في بلدانهم، لتحقيق الهدف الأساسي من اتفاق باريس المتمثل في الحد الأدنى من زيادة درجة حرارة الأرض. وفي هذا الشأن تشيد بلادي بنتائج القمة الرياض الأولى لمبادرة الشرق الأوسط الأخضر، والتي شاركت فيها ليبيا ممثلة في رئيس المجلس الرئاسي، والتي أسست لوضع خريطة طريق إقليمية لمراجعة تحديات التغيير المناخي. ختاماً، نؤكد بأننا ملتزمون في دعم نهج جديد يرتكز على التعاطي الأخضر والتنمية منخفضة الكربون، واتخاذ مزيداً من الخطوات في وقف انبعاثات الغازية الدفيئة، ومنها استخدام الغاز الطبيعي كبديل للوقود السائل في تشغيل العديد من محطات الوقود الكهرباء، وكذلك إيقاف حرق ملايين الأقدام المكعبة من الغازات التي كانت تحرق يومياً أثناء الأعمال المصاحبة للساعات النفطية. كما أننا في نهاية هذا الشهر سنطلق مشروعات في مجال الطاقات المتجددة، والتي ستكون خلال إنتاج 500 ميجاوات، وستكون الخطوة الأولى في بلادنا. ونؤكد بأن خطتنا الوطنية ستراعي كافة الظروف والاستحقاقات الوطنية، وكذلك أهداف التنمية المستدامة 2030 بما يتماشى مع مخرجات اتفاقية باريس. شكرا لكم جميعا والسلام عليكم.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, chers amis, un engagement de l'ensemble des chefs d'État et de gouvernement est plus que jamais indispensable pour répondre à l'urgence climatique et aussi aux aspirations, à ce que attendent de nous aussi nos citoyens. Seule l'atteinte de l'objectif de 1,5 degré Celsius auquel nous avons souscrit à Paris permettra d'éviter notamment les pluies torrentielles, les inondations meurtrières, les feux qui emportent des millions d'hectares et l'élévation du niveau de la mer. Des phénomènes climatiques extrêmes que nous avons connus cette année sur tous les continents. Et je me rappelle quand on parlait encore de catastrophes du siècle, ils sont tout simplement trop réguliers pour pouvoir les qualifier ainsi. Dans ce contexte aussi, je salue la décision du président Biden de rejoindre l'accord de Paris. Il importe en effet que l'ensemble des plus grandes économies prennent des décisions ambitieuses qui s'imposent aujourd'hui. Nous faisons face à un moment de vérité, ça ne sert à rien de se cacher la face. La société civile, les acteurs économiques, les marchés financiers, tous sont confrontés à un diagnostic sans appel. Notre action climatique collective manque d'ambition et sa mise en œuvre est tout simplement trop hésitante. Face à ce cri d'alarme, on l'observe partout dans le monde, une sensibilisation croissante aux défis du changement climatique, une mobilisation citoyenne et énormément de jeunes qui s'intéressent aussi à ce que va être leur monde demain. Et ils veulent faire partie de cette dynamique et aussi de cette transformation. À nous, décideurs politiques ici rassemblés à Glasgow, de ne pas être plus frileux que nos populations prêtent souvent à aller plus loin que nous. En outre, pour être un succès, Glasgow doit absolument agir et dégager un accord sur, premièrement, les règles relatives au marché du carbone et deuxièmement, la synchronisation des calendriers pour mettre à jour les contributions nationales. Mon pays, le Luxembourg, continuera à relever le défi avec détermination. Nous avons rehaussé à 55% notre objectif de réduction de gaz à effet de serre à l'horizon 2030 pour atteindre la neutralité climatique au plus tard en 2050. Ces objectifs sont désormais ancrés dans la loi climat. Des objectifs sectoriels, annuels, également contraignants, viendront compléter ce dispositif. Notre gouvernement a introduit un transport public gratuit et a été en mesure de doubler la production d'énergie renouvelable, permettant ainsi de couvrir dorénavant la consommation de l'ensemble des ménages du Grand-Duché de Luxembourg. Et aujourd'hui, je me réjouis de vous annoncer que mon gouvernement vient aussi d'adopter sa stratégie nationale à long terme en matière d'action climat qui pose des jalons pour une économie décarbonisée, circulaire, résiliente et compétitive. Pour notre pays, l'énergie nucléaire n'est pas une option sûre ni durable. Le principe de primauté de l'efficacité énergétique et le déploiement maximisé des énergies renouvelables guideront nos efforts et nous veillerons à ce que la transition soit socialement juste et inclusive en faisant participer nos citoyens dans la définition de ces objectifs. Ils doivent faire partie de ce débat. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de conclure, de souligner l'importance que notre pays attache aussi à la solidarité internationale. Dès 2019, mon pays avait mis à disposition pour les années 21-25 une enveloppe de 200 millions d'euros à cet effet. Ces fonds additionnels à l'aide publique au développement à laquelle le Luxembourg continuera d'allouer 1% de son RNB seront pour une part croissante investis dans des instruments innovateurs afin de mobiliser des financements privés indispensables pour une action climatique efficace. Aujourd'hui, je peux vous annoncer que le Grand-Duché de Luxembourg augmentera sa contribution de 50% pour l'année prochaine. Monsieur le Président, la crise climatique nous demande d'agir aujourd'hui. Let's go to work. Merci.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Andrew Michael Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, as we gather here at COP26 in the context of a pandemic, the message is clear. Climate change remains a preeminent priority for global action. As we have come to appreciate with the pandemic, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So too with climate change. All countries must act responsibly and with ambition to preserve our climate for current and future generations. Importantly, the pandemic demonstrated that the world has the capacity to develop global solutions in record time when we believe and agree that the problem threatens our safety and security. It also demonstrated the need for equity. Equity is similarly critical to our response to climate change. Countries that have profited the most from carbon over decades have a responsibility to make resources and technology available to others to adapt and transition to low-carbon economies. This was the basis of the 2009 $100 billion per year pledge, which still needs to be met if the developing world is to achieve our resilience and low-carbon emission goals. Additionally, if we are to have any realistic chance of meeting our climate ambitions, we need financing that is predictable, less fragmented, and easier to access. Allow me to emphasize that for small island developing states, the greater need is for funding for loss and damage, which is necessary for our protection and recovery from disasters, as well as for adaptation. There are creative funding solutions. For example, with grant support from our development partners, Jamaica became the first small island state in the world to independently sponsor a catastrophe bond which will provide financial protection against losses from hurricanes. Also, with GCF support, we launched a green bond project with our stock exchange towards mobilizing domestic and regional capital to finance resilient infrastructure projects. Furthermore, in collaboration with the UK government, the GCF, and Oxford University, we are developing a predictive climate risk tool to identify vulnerable areas and guide the building of infrastructure. This will also support sound investment decision-making. Colleagues, while climate change affects all countries, the impact on small island developing states is disproportionately greater. Climate change threatens our very survival. Meeting the 1.5 target is a matter of life and death for us. We are at a pivotal moment in history. All countries must increase their NDC ambitions to get us back on track. Despite significant fiscal constraints and development challenges, Jamaica is acting. We submitted our enhanced NDCs in June 2020, one of the first countries to do so, and launched our implementation plan last month. We have commenced preparation for our 2050 long-term emissions reduction and climate resilience strategy. Our climate-smart agriculture projects are integrating technology and once again attracting young people. Our mangrove restoration program is well underway, together with our efforts to plant 3 million trees in 3 years. And our fish sanctuaries and pilot programs for reef restoration are effectively engaging coastal communities. Colleagues, our actions will determine whether the planet will remain livable for future generations. Let us all play our part and meet this moment with urgent and decisive action.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of Greece. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to address you here today. Let me start by stating the obvious. We are running out of time, and we need to act now. In Greece, as in many other countries, we are already getting a glimpse of the dramatic effects of global warming. This summer, having experienced a record-breaking streak of days with temperatures over 40 degrees, we had to deal with forest fires of unprecedented intensity. And to tackle such challenges, we created a climate crisis ministry. We emphasize the term climate crisis because we are already in need of urgently addressing the consequences of climate change. But we also need to act preemptively. Greece, despite its small carbon footprint, can make a significant contribution in the green transition that goes beyond our ambitious European goals of reducing emissions by 55% by 2030. Let me quickly highlight 6 initiatives, starting from shipping. The Greek-owned commercial fleet is a maritime superpower, accounting for 20% of the global fleet. We're taking the lead in proposing solutions for the decarbonization of maritime transport. Moving to tourism, the climate crisis poses a big threat to Mediterranean tourist destinations. Our pioneering GR Eco strategy will eliminate more than 10 million tons of CO2 by gradually turning our islands into 100% green and sustainable autonomous destinations. In renewables, beyond the traditional wind and solar, we aim to be leaders in offshore wind production with an installed base of 2 gigawatts by 2030. We also want to be innovators in pumped storage hydroelectricity, taking advantage of the country's unique geomorphology. As far as phasing out coal is concerned, we are transitioning to a low-carbon electrification at a faster rate than many European countries. Greece will be lignite-free the latest by 2028, while all old lignite units will be phased out by 2023. As far as ecosystems are concerned, we are taking regulatory action to protect marine biodiversity. We aim to declare 10% of our seas as no-catch zones by 2030. And we are introducing a flagship project, we call that Untrodden Mountains, with the aim to protect our mountains' natural habitat. Finally, interconnections. Greece is steadily transforming itself into a regional hub for green energy. Our recent agreement with Egypt for a new electricity interconnection is a case in point, and Greece is also the logical entry point for green hydrogen produced in the Middle East and in Northern Africa into the European market. Last but not least, the Cabinet will approve this week our new climate bill, which will set ambitious targets with regards to climate change. One last remark, the natural gas price crisis should not derail the strategy of decarbonization. Instead, we should move faster and think out of the box, particularly when it comes to financing the green transition. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached a stage where there is simply no more room for petty politics. Our children and the generations to come will not forgive us. if we fail to coordinate and address this existential threat for humanity. Starting today, I firmly believe that we can live up to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency, Ms. Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister of Bangladesh. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon to you all. Excellencies, while contributing less than 0.47% of global emissions, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries. To address this challenge, we established the Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund in 2009. We have doubled climate-related expenses in the last 7 years. Currently, we are preparing the National Adaptation Plan. Ladies and gentlemen, recently, we submitted an ambitious and updated NDC. Bangladesh has one of the world's most extensive domestic solar energy programs. We hope to have 40% of our energy from renewable sources by 2041. We are going to implement the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan, a journey from climate vulnerability to resilience to climate prosperity. We are trying to address the challenges of climate impact because of 1.1 million forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals or Rohingyas. Because of their staying in Bangladesh, actually those areas become deforested. So it is a big challenge for us. As the chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, CVF and V20, we are promoting the interest of the 48 climate vulnerable countries. We are also sharing best practices and adaptation knowledge regionally through the South Asia office of the Global Center of Adaptations, Dhaka. On behalf of the CVF, Bangladesh is pursuing to establish a climate emergency pact. Excellencies, let me end with following 4 points. First, the major emitters must submit ambitious NDCs and implement those. Second, developed countries should fulfill their commitments of providing $100 billion annually with a 50-50 balance between adaptation and mitigation. Third, the developed countries should disseminate clean and green technology at affordable cost to the most vulnerable countries. The development needs of CVF countries also need to be considered. Fourth, the issue of loss and damage must be addressed, including global sharing of responsibility for climate migrants displaced by sea level rise, salinity increase, river erosion, floods, droughts, and all. I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Stefan, Lachlan, Prime Minister of Sweden. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all of us are well aware of the urgency of climate change. We have all agreed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The science is clear. All actors must raise their ambitions now. and that also means finalizing the Paris rulebook while we're here in Glasgow. In the European Union, we will cut emissions by at least 55% by 2030, and Sweden committed in 2017 to become the first fossil-free welfare nation by, at the latest, 2045, and we intend to keep that promise. Dear friends, the countries that are able must pave the way. Sweden is presently undergoing a transition to net zero that goes hand in hand with growth, job creation, and the rise of a stronger society where no one is left behind. It takes political will to make that happen. It also takes a strong innovation climate and also a workforce secure enough to transition to new green jobs. We have implemented stricter legislation to set our stable and predictable rules. We have invested in education and reskilling. We have enhanced partnerships across sectors, and we are now seeing a massive transformation. Fossil-free steel production, the emergence of circular business models, an electrifying transport sector, and an energy system rapidly converting to renewable sources. My message is this: the climate transition is not only possible, it also brings enormous opportunities with it, opportunities to build better societies, but only so if we ensure that the creation of a sustainable world is a just process benefiting everybody. As we embrace the green transition, we must ensure that all countries can be part of it. We have a goal of $100 billion in climate financing, and I urge all countries to deliver their fair share. It is a shame that we haven't done so far, but let us leave Glasgow proud of have reached that. Sweden recently announced a doubling of our climate finance to $1.75 billion in 2025. We will continue to respond also to developing countries' priorities, allocating roughly half about that climate finance to adaptation. But first, let's make this conference a success. Let's deliver on our commitments. Let's help each other, and let us listen to our children and our youth, what they are urging us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Mohammed Shtayyeh, Prime Minister of the State of Palestine. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Kindly allow me to switch to Arabic. السيدات والسادة، قادة ورؤساء حكومات الدول المشاركة في هذه القمة التاريخية. إن البشرية جمعاء تواجه اليوم الآثار المدمرة للتغير المناخي، والذي بات له انعكاسات كبيرة على البيئة ومستقبل الأجيال القادمة والنظم الاقتصادية. هذه الآثار متفاوتة، فالبعض يؤثر أكثر والبعض يتأثر أكثر. إن هذا يحتم علينا مسؤولية جماعية تماما، مثلما تطلبت مواجهة الكورونا مسؤولية جماعية. في فلسطين عشنا هذا العام صيفا ساخنا، ليس من الناحية السياسية فحسب، بل ارتفاع درجات الحرارة بشكل ملحوظ، رغم أننا لا نساهم سلبا في الانبعاثات السامة والتغير المناخي، بل نتأثر من المحيط بنا. إن إجراءات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي والاستيطان الهادفة لجرف الأرض واحتلال التلال وتحويل مساحات خضراء إلى كتل إسمنتية لتصبح مستعمرات، واستنزاف مصادر المياه وجفاف عدد كبير منها، واعتداءات المستعمرين على الأرض والحجر والشجر، لهو أمر يدعو إلى التوقف الفوري عن هذه الاعتداءات. إن الناظر إلى خارطة فلسطين الحديثة يرى كيف يتم تدمير البيئة بشكل ممنهج. لقد اقتلعت إسرائيل منذ عام 1967 حوالي 2.5 مليون شجرة، منها 800 ألف شجرة زيتون. إن المستعمرات الإسرائيلية والمحاجر ومكبات النفايات سواء كانت الكيماوية أو الإلكترونية والصلبة وغيرها هي أهم الملوثات للبيئة في فلسطين، ومع التغير في المناخ فإن النتائج السلبية تكون أكثر من مضاعفة. إن الموازنة المائية في فلسطين تبلغ 800 مليون متر مكعب في السنة، تسرق منها إسرائيل 600 مليون متر مكعب، ويبقى لنا الباقي. من جانبنا نبذل كل جهد للمساهمة بالجهد الجماعي الدولي لمواجهة التغير في المناخ. لقد وقعنا اتفاقية باريس لعام 2016، وكنا من الأوائل في إعداد الخطة الوطنية للتكيف المناخي، ومنذ أكثر من 10 سنوات تبنينا برنامج تخضير فلسطين، وزرعنا عشرات الآلاف من الأشجار وبرامج لتوليد الكهرباء من النفايات الصلبة ومن الطاقة الشمسية. إن فلسطين فيها 310 أيام مشمسة، وعليه فإن معظم المؤسسات العامة من مساجد وكنائس ومدارس قد بدأت تأخذ طاقتها الكهربائية من الطاقة الشمسية، وقد تم ربط 500 مدرسة بالطاقة الشمسية وسوف نكمل البرنامج. بهذه المناسبة أهنئ المملكة العربية السعودية على المبادرة الرامية لإنشاء صندوق لتخضير الشرق الأوسط. إننا جاهزون للمساهمة في إنجاح هذا الجهد بمشاركة فنية. من جانب آخر فإن صندوق المناخ الأخضر يقدم مساعدات لتوفير مياه في غزة التي أصبحت لضيق مساحتها وحصارها ليس أكثر من كتلة من الإسمنت، وفيها 95% من المياه ملوثة، وكذلك شواطئها، آملين أن نستفيد من صندوق البيئة العالمي جيف حيث لدينا المشاريع للتمويل. إن البحر الميت ينزف بسبب استنزاف مقدراته وما تستخرجه إسرائيل منه من معادن وأملاح لخدمة صناعاتها، وسوف يجف البحر الميت عام 2044 إذا استمرت إسرائيل بأعمالها الحالية. إن المزارع الفلسطيني قد أدخل منذ زمن طويل تكنولوجيا الري بالتنقيط لكي يتعايش مع ما هو متوفر له من كمية مياه محدودة، ولكي يحافظ على مصادر المياه قدر الاستطاعة، لكن للأسف ما نوفره نحن تأخذه إسرائيل. في الختام، إن التحديات التي تواجه فلسطين هي خليط بين التأثر بالمناخ والتأثر بواقع العيش تحت الاحتلال، بما يخلق جرف للبيئة، وإن الإجراءات والسياسات التي تتبناها فلسطين تعطلها إجراءات الاحتلال، خاصة أننا لا نستطيع استخدام جميع أراضينا من أجل الطاقة الشمسية. إن وعي الإنسان الفلسطيني تجاه البيئة والحفاظ عليها بازدياد بسبب البرامج التي تبنيناها في المدارس والجامعات، وأن خطط الحكومة وخاصة خطة التنمية الوطنية قد ارتكزت على الاهتمام بالعلاقة المتداخلة بين المياه والطاقة الشمسية والغذاء. كما أن هناك جهد كبير من شركائنا الدوليين والقطاع الخاص في معالجة المياه العادمة ومياه الصرف الصحي والنفايات. إن الاحتلال يبقى العائق أمام التنمية المستدامة في فلسطين، وعليه يجب أن ينتهي لكي يعيش شعبنا بحرية وكرامة في دولة مستقلة ذات سيادة قابلة للحياة وعاصمتها القدس وحق العودة للاجئين. إنني وباسم الرئيس أبو مازن محمود عباس أتمنى لمؤتمركم النجاح والتوفيق، وأقدم الشكر للأمم المتحدة على تنظيم هذا المؤتمر وللمملكة المتحدة على الاستضافة وحسن الاستقبال، آملا أن يبقى الناس شركاء في الهواء النظيف والشمس المشرقة والمياه النقية والأرض الخضراء. وشكرا لكم جميعا. شكرا.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Kaja Kallas, Prime Minister of Estonia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Distinguished heads of government, dear colleagues, we share a deep concern for our people who struggle with the combined effects of the climate change, COVID-19, economic difficulties, and in far too many cases, real threat to life. Yet I believe that we are hopeful. I'm very proud that the European Union has adopted an ambitious climate law and is determined to make the green transition sustainable and just. The EU has proven that this can be accomplished without sacrificing economic growth. Some say you can afford it because you're rich. But we say we will help you. Estonia is a small country, but we have allocated 1.5 million euros to international climate change collaboration, in addition to the development cooperation funds. But sometimes political will must come before the money. There have been many calls for action in different walks of life, from abandoning coal to increasing biodiversity. Some might say that these are only words, but those words have led to action in between the COPs. However, we understand that not all calls for action are easy to join for each country. We all have our own economic models and specific challenges. Estonia had a very difficult starting position, being almost completely dependent on energy from our national fossil fuel, oil shale. But we have already reduced our emissions by 72%. Green transition is a reality in Estonia. We aim to stop production of electricity from oil shale by 2035 and phase out oil shale-based energy entirely by 2040. We have been helped by the collective political will of the European Union, its carbon market and its support schemes. But the change is driven and implemented by the Estonian people, their openness to reforms, their digital skills, and the vision for the future. As I am proud of EU efforts, I'm also proud of Estonia, our people and companies. I mentioned digital skills. We believe that digital solutions have a big role to play in achieving energy efficiency, waste reduction, as well as another green coal. We want to share our ideas with other countries at this conference and from here on. Data is an important building block in our joint efforts for the fight for climate change. For this reason, Estonia has launched in the UNEP framework a new global cooperation called Data for the Environment Alliance, or DEAL in short. I take this opportunity to invite all the parties to join this initiative to improve data management capacities across the globe. Let the history remember COP26 for its results. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci. Bonjour. Je suis content de représenter les Canadiens dans le cadre de cette rencontre historique. In Canada, there was a town called Lytton. I say was because on June 30th, it burned to the ground. The day before, the temperature had hit 49.6 degrees Celsius, the hottest ever recorded in our country. Canada is warming, on average, twice as quickly as the rest of the world. And in our north, it's 3 times quicker. The science is clear. We must do more and faster. So that's the pledge and the call I bring to this historic meeting. We've already laid the groundwork. In 2015, at the COP in Paris, I committed that Canada would put a price on pollution. We did that. And despite stiff political opposition, the Supreme Court upheld it, and Canadians supported it in our last 2 elections. We know pollution pricing is key to getting emissions down while getting innovation up and running. Our carbon price trajectory is one of the most globally ambitious ones, and it's rising to $170 a ton in 2030. This is a meaningful price on pollution designed not just to make life cleaner, but also make life more affordable and less expensive for Canadians. I call on other countries to do the same. Just as globally we've agreed to a minimum corporate tax, we must work together to ensure it is no longer free to pollute anywhere in the world. That means establishing a shared minimum standard for pricing pollution. Of course, what's even better than pricing emissions is ensuring that they don't happen in the first place. Which brings me to my next major commitment. We'll cap oil and gas sector emissions today and ensure they decrease tomorrow at a pace and scale needed to reach net zero by 2050. That's no small task for a major oil and gas producing country. It's a big step that's absolutely necessary. To do our part globally, we've doubled our climate financing, including up to $1 billion for the transition away from coal. And to help deal with the consequences of climate change, Canada's making our first contribution to the Adaptation Fund. On doit trouver les solutions qui conviennent à nos citoyens dans leur vie quotidienne. C'est pourquoi le Canada s'est fixé comme objectif de vendre uniquement des voitures zéro émission et d'établir un réseau de distribution d'électricité à émissions net zéro d'ici 2035. Comme l'a dit récemment Alok Sharma, Paris a promis, Glasgow doit livrer. La menace que représentent les changements climatiques n'a pas de frontières. C'est pourquoi il faut faire front commun pour arriver à des résultats concrets. Comme on collabore tous pour en finir avec la pandémie de COVID-19, nous devons appliquer cette même urgence d'agir contre la crise climatique et la perte de biodiversité. Over the next 2 weeks, we must demonstrate how we'll deliver on the promise of Paris with transparency and accountability. To the world's most vulnerable who need us to act, to Indigenous people who can show us the way, to young people marching in our streets in cities around the world, we hear you. It's true. Your leaders need to do better. That's why we're here today. What happened in Lytton can and has and will happen anywhere. How many more signs do we need? This is our time to step up and step up together. Merci.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Josiah Voreke Bainimarama, Prime Minister of Fiji. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Mbula Vinaka, and a very good afternoon. Your Excellencies, at COP21 in Paris, 1.5 was a compromise that Fiji struck alongside all of the world's most climate-vulnerable nations. We knew then all the human tragedy that level of warming would mean. But it ensured, at the very least, that low-lying island nations and communities would survive. 6 years on, where has that goodwill gotten us? The world's collective climate commitments will see us fly past 1.5 by the end of the decade. We are losing the race to net zero to a coalition of carbon addicts who would rather fight for coal than for a future of good jobs and innovative industries created by climate ambition. These leaders make pledges, but won't show us plans. They even seek to spin the science, but we cannot let them ride out the urgency of accelerating action. Clean coal, responsible natural gas, and ethical oil are all figments of the shellfish mind. No matter what they call them, carbon emissions are wrecking the climate. There's nothing clean, natural, or ethical about it. Other leaders pursue a policy of appeasement. They sit idly by as their high-emitting counterparts destroy our children's futures. The science is clear, ladies and gentlemen. No city, no community, and no ecosystem will be spared from the reckoning that lies beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, including our oceans, the lungs of the planet. We have fallen so far off course that only bold and courageous action will suffice. 2060 is too late. Empty promises of mid-century ambition are not enough. All high-emitting countries must halve global emissions by 2030. The G20 nations who are prepared to make those commitments must demand the same from others. We have moral authority. You have a moral obligation. Together, our coalition of the willing can keep 1.5 alive, keep low-lying island nations above water, keep erratic and severe weather from devastating us all, and keep the trust between nations so that we can keep faith that our children and grandchildren will have a future. That includes making good on the promise of $100 billion in climate finance. We Pacific nations have not traveled to the other end of the world to watch our future sacrificed at the altar of appeasement of the world's worst emitters. The existence of our low-lying neighbors is not on the negotiating table. 1.5 is alive. It is possible. Humanity does not lack the resources, technology, projects, or innovative potential to achieve it. All that is missing, ladies and gentlemen, is the courage to act, the courage to choose our grandchildren's future over shareholder greed and corporate carbon-driven interests. What more fitting place than the United Kingdom, the birthplace of the industrial age, to summon the will, to secure the commitments that begin a cleaner, greener, and bluer revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Janez Janša, Prime Minister of Slovenia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Dear organizers, heads of states and governments, President of the COP26, Mr. Alok Sharma, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to express my appreciation to the government of the United Kingdom for organizing this very important event. During the next 2 weeks, our relationship with nature and each other will be tested. Now, I think it is high time to deliver a realistic pathway towards the goal of 1.5 degrees. Slovenia, in the role of the EU presidency, is working with our European partners in such direction. However, with only 8% of global CO2 emissions, the EU cannot solve the problem alone. We are committed to do our bidding, and we call on everyone else to do the same. Everyone needs to assume their share of responsibility and thus ensure that our joint efforts will be effective. Our goal is to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 and we are working on updating our climate and energy legislation. Currently, our joint actions as a world are not close of achieving the goals set in Paris. The United Nations estimates that by 2030, greenhouse gases will be 16% higher than they were in 2010. I understand the hesitation. The green transition has to pay attention to its externalities. Our efforts should not endanger social cohesion and also not economic development. In fact, they are a necessary condition for successful reduction of emissions. I believe that technological and also political innovations will enable us to find new ways of ensuring all three objectives. Moving away from coal and oil as a source of our energy is a crucial element in reaching the goals we have set. A nuclear energy as a transitional source could substitute coal and oil. More investment had to be directed into new technologies and to support innovation that would lead to a cleaner, safer, and more efficient production of energy, such as hydrogen or fusion. In any case, we need to present realistic action plans on the matter as soon as possible. I would like to stress that Slovenia remains firmly committed towards achieving our joint target through a realistic approach. We have adopted the long-term strategy which sets the goal and the path towards climate neutrality by 2050. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, answering the challenges and adaptation to climate change is an imperative. We have to make our economies and societies more green and more resilient. Let us contribute our best and make this summit a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of Israel. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, fellow leaders, as we gather here today in Glasgow, we know that history will judge our generation's response to this threat not by how ambitious we are, but by the actions we take. Israel is at the beginning of a revolution on climate change. We recently started implementing our 100-step plan, which means that we're currently doing more to promote clean energy and reduce greenhouse gases than at any other time in our country's history. For the first time, Israel is committing to cutting greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 and will phase out of the use of coal by 2025. Yes, we're making progress, but let's be real. Israel's a small country. We're less than a third of the size of Scotland. So our carbon footprint may be small, but our impact on climate change can be mighty. If we're going to move the needle, we need to contribute Israel's most valuable source of energy, the energy and brain power of our people. You see, this is what fuels our innovation and ingenuity. This is where Israel can make a real difference. Israel may be 60% desert, but we've managed to make it bloom. We may be in one of the driest places on earth, but we've managed to become the world's #1 country in water innovation. As the country with the most startups per capita in the world, we must channel our efforts to saving the world. Behavioral change alone will only take us so far. We're going to need new inventions and new technologies that have not yet been even imagined. And this is why I call upon our entrepreneurs, our innovators in Israel and across the world. You can be the game changers. You can help save the planet. You see, instead of building yet another hyped up internet app, why don't you launch startups that'll help solve this global threat? Israel's national pivot to climate solutions can be only achieved with the right ecosystem. We've done it before. This is why I set up a task force called the Green Sandbox to provide funds to help the entrepreneurs out and ensure that their path is free of bureaucratic bumps. My friends, as we work to keep people safe today, we will also be working for the resilience of tomorrow, where our children will breathe cleaner air, drink cleaner water, and live in a world that treats the planet better than we did. Israel can become the climate innovation nation, and we're ready to pave the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Andrej Babiš, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, the protection of the environment has been replaced by the fight against climate change. The European Union strives to achieve zero emissions by 2050, as envisioned by its Green Deal. However, the 13 legislative proposals, called Fit for 55, go far beyond what the EU has adopted and agreed. Yet only the EU, which produces approximately only 9% of global CO2 emissions, wants to take drastic action to curb its carbon footprint. However, the EU can achieve nothing without the participation of the largest polluters, such as China or United States of America, which are responsible for 25% and 13% respectively of global CO2 emissions. Despite this fact, the European Commission continues to propose dangerous policies such as the ban on combustible engines in 2035 or carbon allowances for transport and individual housing. Due to improper legislature and speculation, the price of emission allowances has gone out of control, resulting in the surging cost of electricity. As a result, and in connection with rapidly rising prices of natural gas, mostly caused by power gains between states, many Europeans could be threatened by energy poverty. Instead of negotiating long-term contracts with Russia, European politicians are busy blocking the transit capacity of the Nord Stream 2 and Opal pipelines, citing worries that the EU will become dependent on Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, this might seem like news to you, but we are already dependent on Russian natural gas and will be for last another 20 to 30 years. Frankly, there is no other way, as the EU annually needs 400 billion cubic meters of natural gas, but produce only 50 billion. The Fit for 55 proposal pays no heed to the conditions and dispositions of individual member states or the ratio of industry to GDP. The European Commission provides no assessment of their impact, no opposing views. We don't know if the goals are not too ambitious. We have no idea how much will this transformation cost or whether we can afford it. This is not a deal, but an ideology. Without answer to these questions, the Green Deal will become the European green suicide. It is absolutely crucial for individual states to choose their own energy mix to achieve carbon neutrality. The Czech Republic cannot rely on renewable energy alone. Our landscape and climatic conditions simply do not permit this. For the Czech Republic, nuclear power and natural gas are the only possible means of achieving zero CO2 emissions. Especially nuclear energy is clean, safe, reliable, and affordable power source, and the EU member states and the European Commission should acknowledge this. The Green Deal could come at huge social, economic, political, and geopolitical cost. Cost which could create enormous tensions in society and between allies, open doors to radicals, and threaten our democracy. The Green Deal could be responsible for the loss of competitiveness of the EU, the impoverishment of families, for rising unemployment, astronomical energy prices, the disintegration of industry, and in the end, the destruction of the environment it seeks to protect. The Green Deal simply wants too much, too soon, and at any cost. Given the current market situation, rising prices of energy and commodities, the disruption in supply chains and shortage of goods, I believe it is necessary to set a realistic strategy for the implementation of the Green Deal. We must calculate the cost, assess the impacts, set individual targets, and provide EU member states with maximum flexibility. The timing of this conference couldn't have come at a better time. Recent development provides us with an urgent wake-up call to start approaching green policies without ideology, critically and rationally, and to promote changes gradually in such a way which is economically, politically, and socially sustainable. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Gaston Alfonso Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I make this statement on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. And I begin by thanking the government of the United Kingdom for hosting this very important World Leaders Summit, from which much is expected. Small island developing states attend this meeting troubled that the world is teetering dangerously on the precipice of a climate catastrophe if we overshoot the 1.5 degrees goal with fatal consequences, especially for small island states. Those effects have been evident in more frequent and catastrophic climate events that have decimated lives and livelihoods. The difference between small island developing states and industrialized nations is the capacity to respond. It takes a single storm, a few hours, to destroy the economy and infrastructure of an entire small island state, which lacks the necessary financial and other resources to rebound and rebuild. Colleagues, this is now the perennial experience that small island developing states suffer through no fault of their own. This situation has weakened our ability to plan our economic and social development with predictability. Colleagues, I remind that the contribution of all small island states to carbon dioxide emissions and climate change is less than 1% of global emissions. Our countries are the least liable for the damage to the world's environment, but we pay the highest price. I recall the words of Aristotle: the greatest injustices proceed from those who pursue excess. Surely, the time has come for such excesses and injustice to end. Colleagues, the scale of funding for climate adaptation and mitigation has been sadly inadequate. It needs to be increased significantly if justice is to be served. EOSIS calls for direct attention to loss and damage at this COP as a distinct issue in its own right, not just on the margins of adaptation. Such loss and damage have persisted for decades, but compensation has been neglected by the governments of the worst polluting countries for far too long. Should no formal mechanism for loss and damage compensation be established, member countries of the United Nations may be prepared to seek justice in the appropriate international bodies. We hoped that no one would have had to come to such a position, but our very existence now depends on urgent attention to our perilous situation. Colleagues, we are all aware that the promise made 12 years ago by the developed countries to provide $100 billion in climate finance to help deal with the effects of climate change has not been fulfilled. However, the G20 countries have, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, provided over $3 billion in support to the fossil fuel industry, including excessive subsidies, with only a meager $2 billion per year made available through the UN's climate funds. We are also aware that the OECD has confirmed that climate finance to SIDS dropped by more than $600 million between 2018 and 2019. Colleagues, we can all agree that this is indeed regressive. Worse yet, such financing as available is subject to conditionalities, including the inconsiderate and wrongful per capita income. These conditionalities should not be applied to climate finance, and SIDS accessibility should be based on vulnerability. Colleagues, all of this makes COP26 a truly decisive moment for small island countries with low-lying coastal states. This is the last decade the world has to avoid the worst impacts of global warming, and COP26 is our last chance to deliver on ambitious commitments and actions to avert catastrophic consequences. I plead that we do not squander this crucial opportunity. COP26 should deliver the following commitments: reduce emissions to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, scale up and accessible adaptation and mitigation funding, and a firm mechanism for loss and damage as we work in solidarity to save our planet and human civilization. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency General Prayut Chan-o-cha, Prime Minister of Thailand. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
ท่านประธานและท่านผู้นำทุกท่านผมมาร่วมประชุมวันนี้เพื่อเป็นการยืนยันว่าประเทศไทยให้ความสำคัญสูงสุดกับการแก้ไขปัญหาการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศโดยไทยพร้อมจะร่วมมือกับทุกประเทศและทุกภาคส่วนเพื่อให้บรรลุเป้าหมายร่วมกันในการแก้ปัญหาครั้งสำคัญที่สุดครั้งหนึ่งของโลกเพราะภารกิจนี้ก็คือความเป็นความตายของโลกและอนาคตของลูกหลานพวกเราทุกคนในปัจจุบันไทยปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกออกในปริมาณเพียงประมาณ0.72%ของการปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกทั่วทั้งโลกแต่ประเทศไทยกลับเป็น1 ใน 10 ประเทศที่จะได้รับผลกระทบร้ายแรงที่สุดจากการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศและนี่คือเหตุผลสำคัญที่ผมไปร่วมการประชุมสุดยอดเรื่องภูมิอากาศของสหประชาชาติที่กรุงปารีสเมื่อปี 2015 โดยไทยอยู่ในประเทศกลุ่มแรกที่ให้สัตยาบันเข้าเป็นภาคีของความตกลงปารีสคำมั่นสัญญาของไทยนั้นมิใช่คำมั่นที่ว่างเปล่าในช่วงเวลาที่ผ่านมาไทยได้ปฏิบัติตามคำมั่นทุกประการที่ให้ไว้กับประชาคมโลกอย่างต่อเนื่องและมีการดำเนินการอย่างแข่งขันภายในประเทศภายใต้กรอบอนุสัญญาสหประชาชาติว่าด้วยการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศไทยได้กำหนดเป้าหมายนามาเพื่อลดการปลดปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกในภาคพลังงานและขนส่งอย่างน้อย7%ภายในปี 2020 แต่ถ้าว่าในปี 2019 ไทยสามารถลดก๊าซเรือนกระจกได้แล้ว17%ซึ่งเกินเป้าหมายที่เราตั้งไว้กว่า2 เท่าและก่อนเวลาที่กำหนดไว้มากกว่า1 ปีนอกจากนี้ไทยยังเป็นประเทศแรกที่จัดส่ง NDC ฉบับปรับปรุงปี 2020 และจะทำแผนงานต่างๆในระดับประเทศระดับท้องถิ่นล่าสุดไทยส่งยุทธศาสตร์ระยะยาวนั้นการพัฒนาแบบปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกระดับต่ำให้กับ UNFCCC โดยไทยเป็นประเทศแรกๆที่จะทำยุทธศาสตร์นี้ วันนี้ผมมาพร้อมกับเจตนารมณ์ที่เป็นความท้าทายอย่างยิ่งว่าประเทศไทยจะยกระดับการแก้ไขปัญหาสภาพภูมิอากาศอย่างเต็มที่และด้วยทุกวิถีทางเพื่อให้ประเทศไทยบรรลุเป้าหมายความเป็นกลางทางคาร์บอนภายในปี 2050 และบรรลุเป้าหมายการปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกสุดที่เป็นศูนย์ในปี 2065 หรือก่อนหน้านั้นด้วยการสนับสนุนทางด้านการเงินและเทคโนโลยีอย่างเต็มที่และเท่าเทียมรวมถึงการเสริมสร้างขีดความสามารถจากความร่วมมือระหว่างประเทศและกลไกภายใต้กรอบอนุสัญญาผมมั่นใจว่าประเทศไทยจะสามารถยกระดับ NDC ของเราขึ้นเป็น40%ได้จะทำให้การปล่อยก๊าซเรือนกระจกของสุทธิของไทยเป็นศูนย์ได้ภายในปี 2050 ขณะนี้ประเทศไทยนำแนวคิดเศรษฐกิจชีวภาพเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนเศรษฐกิจสีเขียวหรือ BCG มาเป็นยุทธศาสตร์แห่งชาติเพื่อนำไปสู่การปรับกระบวนทัศน์และพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจที่ไม่ทำลายระบบนิเวศซึ่งไทยจะนำแผนนี้มาเป็นวาระหลักของการประชุมเอเปกที่ไทยจะเป็นเจ้าภาพในปีหน้าสุดท้ายนี้ผมคิดว่าหมดเวลาแล้วนะครับสำหรับความล้มเหลวอีกและโลกกำลังบอกเราว่าการประทุษร้ายธรรมชาติต้องยุติเพียงเท่านี้เพื่อการดำรงไว้ซึ่งแหล่งอาหารแหล่งน้ำและแหล่งอากาศที่ทุกคนต้องหายใจร่วมกันดังนั้นมนุษย์จะต้องมีความกล้าหาญมีความชาญฉลาดมีการรู้คิดมีความอดทนสูงสุดเพื่อนำชัยชนะมาสู่ลูกหลานของเราผมขอย้ำว่าเราทุกคนไม่มีแผน2ในเรื่องของการรักษาเยียวยาสภาพภูมิอากาศเพราะเราจะไม่มีโลกที่2ซึ่งเป็นบ้านของพวกเราเหมือนโลกนี้อีกแล้วขอบคุณครับ
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Sher Bahadur Deuba, Prime Minister of Nepal. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Nepal remains firmly committed to the implementation of Paris Agreement. We have submitted an ambitious NDC that plans to decarbonize our economy in all sectors. Nepal aims to reach a net zero emission by 2045, will ensure that 15% of our total energy demand is supplied from clean energy sources and maintains 45% of our country under forest cover by 2030. With abundant water, forest and biodiversity resources, Nepal can be a leader in sharing clean, green, nature-based climate solution in the region. With temperature rising higher than the global average, glaciers are receding, snowfall is decreasing, and permafrost is melting in the Himalayan region. Extreme climate events are increasing, causes huge economic and ecological losses with precious human lives. Around 80% of Nepal's population are at the risk of natural and climate-induced hazards. During the last 40 years, natural disasters have caused close to $66 billion on physical, economical damage in my country alone. Rapid warming in the Himalaya poses a serious threat to food, water, energy, and human security of the entire region. Glacier melting also contributes to the existential threat to the coastal and island countries due to sea level rise. I therefore urge world leaders to recognize specific climate vulnerability in high mountains and accord to high priority to the mountain agenda in all climate-related negotiations. Keeping the global temperature below 1.5 centigrade is vital for mountain people. It is an issue of our survival to raise awareness on the climate crisis in the Himalaya, my government will host Sagarmatha Sambar dialogue named after Mount Everest. Nepal is an LDC country is making sincere efforts to balance our development and climate actions. We are engaging with all stakeholders, including the private sectors, indigenous people, disadvantaged community, women, youth, in all our climate actions, recognizing the value of nature to both adapt and mitigate climate change. We have decided to create a dedicated institution for working on nature, conservation, and climate change together. Loss and damage has become key concern due to increased phenomena of climate-induced disaster. This subject must find a place under Article 4.8 of the Convention. We call upon the private sectors, we call upon the parties to agree on making loss and damage to stand-alone agenda for negotiating and support additional frameworks. The COP26 must ensure adequate adaptation support for the most vulnerable countries by scaling up financial, technical, and capacity building support. We can deliver our goal by through quick, direct, easy access to climate finance. We agree the parties to agree on the clear roadmap for a new collective, quantified, and ambitious goal to climate finance before 2025. Mr. President, the decision we make, COP26 must do justice to those affected now, the future generation and Mother Nature, and the future of our planet together depends on what we decide at this conference. I totally agree with Prime Minister Boris Johnson that this is truly the last chance to save the Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Pravind K. Jugnauth, Prime Minister of Mauritius. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the need to limit the rising global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius and reach carbon neutrality by 2050 is no longer a desirable objective. It is a critical imperative if we want to avoid a major catastrophe and hopefully put back our planet on a sustainable course. For small island countries like Mauritius, global warming and rising sea levels represent an existential challenge which will cause tremendous damage and lead to massive displacement of people, especially from low-lying islands. Concrete action, accompanied by adequate and predictable funding, is therefore absolutely essential. We all have a responsibility to address this challenge, and Mauritius is prepared to do its share. We therefore commit to take actions that will contribute towards the following. First, reducing gas emission by 40% by 2030. 2, achieving 60% of green energy in our energy mix by 2030. 3, phasing out coal in electricity generation before 2030. 4, promoting a circular economy involving 70% of waste from landfills by 2030. 5th, encouraging the use of electric vehicles. And 6, promoting smart agriculture and island-wide tree planting programs. These actions, along with several others, will pave the way for Mauritius to become a climate-resilient and low-emission country. At the same time, we expect our partners to do their share and ensure that the Glasgow package focuses on 1. Enhance action on adaptation, including financing for adaptation. 2. Addressing loss and damage caused by climate change. 3. Narrowing the emissions gap with new targets for 2030. 4. Fulfilling the $100 billion a year finance commitment and ensuring simplified access to these funding by SIDS and other vulnerable countries. And 5, adaptation and mitigation. These actions constitute the basic elements of a comprehensive and global strategy to address this challenge. More particularly, they will represent restorative justice for the most vulnerable countries. As leaders, we have a huge responsibility towards our people and posterity. We have no right to fail them. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Chinh Minh Pham, Prime Minister of Vietnam. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thưa Ngài Phó Chủ tịch, thưa quý vị đại biểu, biến đổi khí hậu là thực sự trở thành thách thức lớn nhất đối với nhân loại. Các hiện tượng thời tiết cực đoan và tình trạng nước biển dâng cao đang ảnh hưởng nghiêm trọng đến an ninh lương thực, an ninh nguồn nước, đến sự phát triển bền vững, thậm chí đe dọa tồn vong của nhiều quốc gia và cộng đồng dân cư của chúng ta. Lời cảnh báo này của tự nhiên buộc chúng ta phải cùng chung tay hành động mạnh mẽ hơn nữa, có trách nhiệm và không chậm trễ trên phạm vi toàn cầu. Đây là vấn đề toàn cầu nên phải có cách tiếp cận toàn cầu. Đây là vấn đề ảnh hưởng đến mọi người dân nên phải có cách tiếp cận toàn dân. Vì vậy tôi đề nghị, thứ nhất, ứng phó với biến đổi khí hậu, phục hồi tự nhiên phải trở thành ưu tiên cao nhất trong mọi quyết sách phát triển, là tiêu chuẩn đạo đức cao nhất của mọi cấp, mọi ngành, mọi doanh nghiệp và mọi người dân. Khoa học công nghệ phải đi trước để dẫn dắt và nguồn lực tài chính phải là đòn bẩy, thúc đẩy chuyển đổi mô hình phát triển hướng tới kinh tế xanh, tuần hoàn, bền vững, bao trùm và nhân văn. Mọi hành động phải dựa vào tự nhiên, lấy người dân làm trung tâm, làm chủ thể và là động lực cho sự phát triển bền vững, không để ai bỏ lại phía sau. Thứ hai, tất cả các quốc gia cần cam kết mạnh mẽ hơn nữa về giảm phát thải khí nhà kính trên nguyên tắc trách nhiệm chung, nhưng có khác biệt phù hợp với điều kiện hoàn cảnh, năng lực của từng quốc gia. Nhân đây tôi cũng kêu gọi phải có công bằng, công lý về biến đổi khí hậu. Đây là đòi hỏi tất yếu để cùng nhau kiềm chế mức độ tăng nhiệt độ của trái đất. Về phần mình, mặc dù là nước đang phát triển, mới chỉ bắt đầu tiến trình công nghiệp hóa trong hơn 30 thập kỷ vừa qua, Việt Nam là một nước có lợi thế về năng lượng tái tạo, sẽ xây dựng và triển khai các biện pháp giảm phát thải nhà kính mạnh mẽ bằng nguồn lực của chính mình, cùng với sự hợp tác và hỗ trợ của cộng đồng quốc tế, nhất là các nước đang phát triển. Kể cả tài chính và chuyển giao công nghệ, trong đó thực hiện các cơ chế theo thỏa thuận Paris để đạt mức phát thải ròng bằng không vào năm 2050. Thứ ba, tài chính khí hậu, chuyển giao công nghệ và nâng cao năng lực đóng vai trò rất quan trọng để thực hiện thành công thỏa thuận Paris. Các quốc gia phát triển đã phát thải nhiều trong quá khứ để đạt được sự thịnh vượng kinh tế ngày nay, cần thực hiện đầy đủ các cam kết tài chính đã có, đồng thời khẩn trương đề ra mục tiêu tài chính tham vọng hơn nữa cho giai đoạn 2025. Thưa quý vị, là một trong những quốc gia chịu tác động nặng nề nhất do biến đổi khí hậu, Việt Nam đang hết sức nỗ lực vừa ứng phó với biến đổi khí hậu, vừa phát triển kinh tế để vươn lên, bảo đảm cuộc sống ngày càng tốt hơn cho mọi người dân, đồng thời đóng góp có trách nhiệm cùng với cộng đồng quốc tế. Chúng tôi mong muốn tăng cường hợp tác với các đối tác quốc tế trong các chương trình, dự án đầu tư và phát triển bền vững. Chủ tịch Hồ Chí Minh, anh hùng giải phóng dân tộc, danh nhân văn hóa thế giới đã từng nói: đoàn kết là sức mạnh, đoàn kết, đại đoàn kết, thành công, đại thành công. Để chiến thắng trong cuộc chiến toàn cầu này với biến đổi khí hậu, đoàn kết toàn cầu là cách thức duy nhất chúng ta cùng bàn, cùng làm và cùng chiến thắng. Bắt đầu từ ý chí, nhận thức, giải pháp, tổ chức thực hiện cho đến đảm bảo nguồn lực. Những cam kết và hành động mang tính lịch sử của tất cả chúng ta hôm nay sẽ giúp để lại một hành tinh xanh, một không gian sinh tồn bền vững và hạnh phúc cho tất cả các thế hệ mai sau. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Irakli Garibashvili, Prime Minister of Georgia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Dear President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, on behalf of the people of Georgia and our COP26 delegation, it is a great privilege for me to address this historic gathering. I want to first of all express my sincere appreciation to the United Kingdom for its dedication to bring us together and make the COP26 a reality in light of the ongoing challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. Excellencies, we all know that our living environment is changing. The Caucasus, a beautiful land of mountains, glaciers and rivers, has already lost 40% of its glaciers. During the last 2 decades alone, the speed of glacier loss in the eastern Georgia has exceeded projections from the end of the 20th century. We fully share the alarm presented by UN Secretary General's latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that declared a code red for humanity. The report makes crystal clear that the combined commitments of each nation in the nationally determined contributions are insufficient to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases below dangerous levels, and that greater ambition and effort is needed if we are to meet the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement and avert a global disaster. The challenges are clear, but so are the solutions. We must rise to these challenges and increase our commitment to developing more productive, stable and resilient societies. The investments in clean energy, climate-smart agriculture, and enhanced adaptive capacity represent concrete steps for reducing emissions and preparing our societies for the unavoidable impacts of climate change. We must embrace the Secretary General's key proposals to protect our planet, reflected in our common agenda. In that spirit, Georgia has committed by 2030 to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by more than half compared to its 1990 levels, and to deepen the understanding of its adaptive capacity to climate change through international partnerships. The government of Georgia has a development plan with a clear vision for 2030 that aligns perfectly with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For its part, Georgia will achieve this by diversifying its renewable energy sector, expanding the share of wind and solar segments in its energy market, transforming the country's urban mobility, developing low-carbon approaches in the construction, industrial and waste sectors, advancing climate-smart technologies and services, and increasing the carbon capturing capacity of Georgia's magnificent forests. Of course, we are here because none of us can meet these challenges alone. Leaders from government, industry, academia, subject matter professionals, technical experts and stakeholders in every community, from every country and from every region must act jointly to solve the climate crisis by building low-carbon and resilient economies. From small towns and villages to large urban areas, we must all pledge to the younger population today and for future generations that preserving our planet is non-negotiable. We must act. And lastly, let me mention that the COP26 has critical importance for our national and regional interest. Equitable geographical representation, the sovereign equality and dignity of all states are fundamental bedrock principles of the United Nations. Georgia wishes to realize the widest possible cooperation under the Convention, as it is noted in its preamble in response to this uniquely global challenge. My country wishes to thank the Presidency and all parties for their spirit of compassion and their willingness to move forward on agenda-related proposals, including the need to address equitable geographical representation. Georgia looks forward to working with the Presidency and our partners to address these issues in a collaborative, transparent and equitable manner. No one should be left behind in this fight. We look forward to bold and visionary outcomes from the COP26 that will dramatically advance our collective climate ambition and help us build back from the pandemic, greener, stronger and more secure than ever. The next generation are counting on us to deliver on our promises. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Moketsi Majoro, Prime Minister of Lesotho. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellencies, it is appropriate that we meet in person amidst challenges presented by COVID-19 to debate and hopefully take decisions that we, as global leadership, has so far procrastinated on for far too long. The human race coexists with nature in what has to be a symbiotic relationship of accommodation. But we have abused that relationship in pursuit of unbalanced technological and industrial progress. Fossil fuel-driven economic growth and wealth creation has benefited a few countries, but their negative impacts on climate change are being felt widely across the globe. Global temperatures have increased by more than 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial period from technologies that have dangerously changed our ecosystem. The impacts are dire. Our communities are now experiencing frequent flooding. 50 or 100-year floods are now occurring in our lifetimes. Planting seasons have shortened as rains have delayed. Droughts are more frequent and blistering. Warm temperature extremes are more frequent. Cold spells occur during summer seasons. Roads, houses, fields, burial places all get washed away. And this is what we live with today. These changes have negatively impacted all facets of life, including on access to food, water, energy, health, and education. But there are no fiscal resources in-country or from international funds for adaptation and restitution. National reserves have been depleted by responses to COVID-19, while access to global climate finance mechanisms remain effectively shut. Clearly, we are not in a position to quarrel with scientific inquiry because their predictions have come to bear in our communities. We are disappointed that others feel we still have time, notwithstanding scientific conclusions that we must act now, decisively and ambitiously. For us developing countries, and Lesotho in particular, the present level of global warming should be the ultimate cap on warming. Based on our anemic response to climate change so far, it is indeed folly to experiment with and accept higher greenhouse concentrations. provision of upscale predictable financial resources by developed countries is key to Lesotho to end the sustainability of her adaptation actions. Technology and capacity building support for adaptation actions at national and local levels in Lesotho is sorely needed. Also, the adaptation modalities, procedures, and guidelines need to comprehensively include measures to address social impacts of climate change. Sustainability of climate-friendly actions in developing countries will depend on the literacy of future generations on climate change. Strengthening scientific knowledge in a manner that informs climate services and supports decision-making is necessary for Lesotho. Research centers must be supported, strengthened, both financially and technologically. Finally, the future of the planet, which we are discussing at the occasion of this COP26, belongs to young people. They will inherit the climate of the future for which our decisions today will determine. It is not important, is it not important that they are in the room, that they share our vision of that future, that they are equipped with the capacity to adapt and mitigate global warming? After all, it is their planet to inherit. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. John A. Briceño, Prime Minister of Belize. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, I'm here as a Belizean and as a global citizen to call for solidarity. As a member of AOSIS, Belize is here to demand urgent action to combat climate change. Climate change is the greatest challenge to humanity, devastating in its impacts on every aspect of our lives, especially on those most vulnerable. Belize is a proud custodian of the Belize Barrier Reef System, the second largest reef system in the world and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But here is the sad reality. Coral bleaching stress doubled from 1.7 in the period 1985 to 2014 to severe level 3 between 2014 and 2017. The reef is dying and may be beyond the point of full restoration. For Belize, the Belize Barrier Reef is more than a global beauty. It also underpins our culture and our tourism industry, which contributes approximately 40% to our domestic product, our gross domestic product. Without the reefs, Belize's economy could crumble. Our people's lives will be forever changed. Excellencies, the threat to our barrier reef is a direct result of human-induced climate change. That is an undeniable fact. Belize is doing what it can to slow the impacts. Belize's annual average losses from extreme weather events are now approaching 4% of GDP. Forced to accumulate an unsustainable debt load for disaster recoveries has become an unbearable cost. We all know, however, that acting together, we can and we must. We have a collective duty to do what's right. COP26 is a tipping point for climate change, and Belize is doing more than its fair share. Over 60% of our land has forest cover, more than 40% of which is protected for conservation and biodiversity, while roughly 15% of our marine area is under protection. both on land and in the sea, we have exceeded conservation targets. I am pleased to announce that Belize just entered a $360 million debt for marine conservation transaction, the largest blue bond transaction ever, and established a permanent $100 million US Marine Conservation Trust Fund. We will increase our marine protected biodiversity zones by 30% by 2026, 4 years ahead of our target, and we will place all remaining public lands in the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System under protection. Belize is proud of our record on conservation, but all will be lost if the countries of the G20 obfuscate and abdicate their responsibilities to act. With right on our side, we demand climate justice. We demand immediate action, ambitious action to save our planet. To date, NDCs of the major emitters are not in line with the objective of the Paris Agreement. This places the world at risk of global warming close to 3 degrees. These same countries account for 3/4 of global emissions and 80% of global GDP. They channel trillions of dollars towards fossil fuels, while developed countries shrink their commitment to deliver a bare minimum of $100 billion US per annum. This is rank negligence. We need to get serious. Developed countries must not only deliver, but increase their commitments on climate finance. $100 billion US per year can only now serve as the baseline. Funding for adaptation must be dramatically increased. At a minimum, developed countries need to more than double public finance adaptation. We need to move from carbon trading towards carbon emission reduction mechanisms with rules that apply to everyone. For this to work, credits should only be generated from activities within nationally determined contributions. There should be no double counting of emissions reduction credits, and a material share of proceeds should go to the Adaptation Fund, while a portion of credits cancelled as a fundamental contribution to global emissions reductions. Now, let's be clear. Net zero by 2050 should not get the G20 off the hook from having emissions by 2030. The former means nothing without the latter. Mr. President, the people of Belize and the developing world have heard enough talk, been disappointed by empty promises, and are skeptical of pious pledges. Every dollar my country invests in climate action, G20 countries undo multiple times over with the trillions they invest in oil, coal, and gas. Every step forward we make on development is easily reversed by the failure of G20 countries to act in line with the Paris promise of 1.5. Belize is taking ambitious action, but there are some amongst us with a much bigger duty to act. Mother Earth can wait no more. She can suffer no more. She is dying. Mr. President, the world is watching. People are awaiting the outcomes of COP26. This is the COP to stand with the vulnerable, to show you are for us, not against us. We all know what we need to do. We must summon the courage and moral strength to act. None of us can afford to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Mateusz Morawiecki, Prime Minister of Poland.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, COP26 in Glasgow is an important milestone in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I hope we will be able to finish the Katowice rulebook. We live in a world recovering from COVID-19 crisis. The EU was the first leading economy to adopt the 2050 climate neutrality target. Last year, the EU decided to increase the reduction in emissions by 2030 from 40% to 55%. Many countries have followed in the EU's footsteps, but global challenges require global efforts. And each of us should have a just and appropriate share of these efforts. We are heading towards climate neutrality, but we must not forget about both the economic consequences of the pandemic and the development diversity of individual countries and regions. Not all of us start from the same point, but we should all remember one principle: transformation cannot take place at the expense of people. To win public support, green policy must put the citizens' well-being at the heart of the change. A joint and fair transition is the foundation of the recovery and development programs. If domestic and global policies are to achieve common goals, they must create not only a resilient economy, but also a resilient society that leaves no one behind. There are at least 3 stages on this road. First one, good work. With the economic recovery, we must seize the opportunity to create better paid jobs and reduce social inequalities. Thanks to the use of renewable energy sources, we aim to create 300,000 new jobs in Poland. Second, cheap energy. This priority is now more relevant than ever. The revolution in the renewable energy market creates opportunities for the production of cheap and clean energy. We should all make the most of this. In Poland, we have invested very heavily in photovoltaics. The total solar capacity installed in Poland is over 4.1 gigawatts, which means an increase of 250% year on year. And third stage, a clean environment. A fair transition, in addition to the distant challenges for the rest of this century, must also bring most tangible changes on a local scale. That is why Poland has intensified activities to reduce smog in cities and towns. In the coming years, we plan to eliminate 3 million coal furnaces, switching to zero-emission public transformation, and support electromobility in the passenger car segment. I believe that all of those efforts are going to be supported by rapid technological development ahead of us. May our meeting in Glasgow be another opportunity to build bridges and a new milestone for our ambitions and recipes for the effective implementation in the spirit of a socially fair transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Narendra Damodar Das Modi, Prime Minister of India. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
फ्रेंड्स, आज मैं आपके बीच उस भूमि का प्रतिनिधित्व कर रहा हूं जिस भूमि ने हजारों वर्ष पहले ये मंत्र दिया था, समगच्छध्वं समद्वत्वं संवो मानसी जानताम। आज 21वीं सदी में ये मंत्र और ज्यादा महत्वपूर्ण हो गया है, प्रासंगिक हो गया है। समगच्छध्वं यानी सभी साथ मिलकर चले, संबद्धम यानी सभी मिलजुल कर आपस में संवाद करें, और संवो मनानसी जानताम यानी सभी के मन भी आपस में मिले रहें। फ्रेंड्स, जब मैं पहली बार क्लाइमेट समिट में पेरिस आया था तब मेरा यह इरादा नहीं था कि दुनिया में हो रहे अनेक वायदों में एक वायदा अपना भी जोड़ दूं। मैं पूरी मानवता के लिए एक चिंता के साथ आया था। मैं उस संस्कृति के प्रतिनिधि के रूप में आया था जिसने सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः अर्थात सभी सुखी रहे का संदेश दिया है। और इसलिए मेरे लिए पेरिस में हुआ आयोजन एक समिट नहीं, सेंटिमेंट था, एक कमिटमेंट था। और भारत वो वायदे विश्व से नहीं कर रहा था, बल्कि वो वायदे 125 करोड़ भारतवासी अपने आप से कर रहे थे। और मुझे खुशी है कि भारत जैसा विकासशील देश जो करोड़ों लोगों को गरीबी से बाहर निकालने में जुटा है, जो करोड़ों लोगों की ईज ऑफ लिविंग पर रात दिन काम कर रहा है, आज विश्व की आबादी का 17% होने के बावजूद जिसकी एमिशंस में रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी सिर्फ 5% रही है, उस भारत ने अपना कर्तव्य पूरा करके दिखाने में कोई कसर बाकी नहीं छोड़ी है। आज पूरा विश्व मानता है कि भारत एकमात्र बड़ी अर्थव्यवस्था है जिसने पेरिस कमिटमेंट पर लेटर एंड स्पिरिट में डिलीवर किया है। हम संकल्पबद्ध होकर हर संभव एफर्ट्स कर रहे हैं, परिश्रम कर रहे हैं और परिणाम लाकर दिखा रहे हैं। फ्रेंड्स, आज जब मैं आपके बीच आया हूं तो भारत के ट्रैक रिकॉर्ड को भी लेकर के आया हूं। मेरी बातें सिर्फ शब्द नहीं हैं, ये भावी पीढ़ी के उज्जवल भविष्य का जयघोष है। आज भारत इंस्टॉल्ड रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी कैपेसिटी में विश्व में 4थे नंबर पर है। बीते 7 वर्षों में भारत की नॉन फोसिल फ्यूल एनर्जी में 25% से ज्यादा की वृद्धि हुई है और अब ये हमारे एनर्जी मिक्स का 40% पहुंच गया है। फ्रेंड्स, विश्व की पूरी आबादी से भी अधिक यात्री भारतीय रेल से हर वर्ष यात्रा करते हैं। इस विशाल रेलवे सिस्टम ने अपने आप को 2030 तक नेट जीरो बनाने का लक्ष्य रखा है। अकेली इस पहल से सालाना 60 मिलियन टन एमिशन की कमी होगी। इसी प्रकार हमारे विशाल एलईडी बल्ब अभियान से सालाना 40 मिलियन टन एमिशन कम हो रहा है। आज भारत दृढ़ इच्छा शक्ति के साथ ऐसे कई सारे इनिशिएटिव्स पर तेजी से काम कर रहा है। इसके साथ ही भारत ने अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर दुनिया का सहयोग करने के लिए इंस्टीट्यूशनल सॉल्यूशन भी दिए हैं। सोलर पावर में एक क्रांतिकारी कदम के रूप में हमने इंटरनेशनल सोलर अलायंस की पहल की। क्लाइमेट एडप्शन के लिए हमने कोलिशन फॉर डिजास्टर रेजिलिएंट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का निर्माण किया है। ये करोड़ों जिंदगियों को बचाने के लिए एक संवेदनशील और महत्वपूर्ण पहल है। फ्रेंड्स, मैं एक और महत्वपूर्ण विषय पर आप सभी का ध्यान केंद्रित करना चाहता हूं। आज विश्व मान रहा है कि क्लाइमेट चेंज में लाइफस्टाइल की एक बहुत बड़ी भूमिका है। मैं आज आपके सामने एक वन वर्ड मूवमेंट का प्रस्ताव रखता हूं। वन वर्ड एक शब्द क्लाइमेट के संदर्भ में वन वर्ल्ड एक विश्व का मूल आधार बन सकता है, अधिष्ठान बन सकता है। ये एक शब्द है लाइफ, LIFE, यानी लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरमेंट। आज जरूरत है कि हम सभी लोग एक साथ आकर कलेक्टिव पार्टिसिपेशन के साथ लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरमेंट यानी लाइफ को एक अभियान की तरह आगे बढ़ाएं। ये एनवायरमेंटल कॉन्शियस लाइफस्टाइल का एक मास मूवमेंट बन सकता है। आज आवश्यकता है माइंडलेस और डिस्ट्रक्टिव कंजम्पशन के बजाय माइंडफुल और डेलिबरेट यूटिलाइजेशन की। ये मूवमेंट एक साथ मिलकर ऐसे लक्ष्य तय कर सकता है जो डाइवर्स एरिया जैसे फिशिंग, एग्रीकल्चर, वेलनेस, डाइटरी चॉइसेस, हाउसिंग, पैकेजिंग, हॉस्पिटैलिटी, टूरिज्म, क्लोथिंग, फैशन, वाटर मैनेजमेंट और एनर्जी जैसे अनेक सेक्टर्स में एक क्रांतिकारी बदलाव ला सकता है। ये ऐसे विषय हैं जहां हम में से प्रत्येक को हर रोज कॉन्शियस चॉइस करनी होगी। पूरी दुनिया में करोड़ों अरबों लोगों के हर रोज की ये चॉइसेस क्लाइमेट चेंज के खिलाफ लड़ाई को हर दिन बिलियन स्टेप्स आगे ले जाएगी। और मैं इस आर्थिक आधार पर, वैज्ञानिक आधार पर, बीती शताब्दी के अनुभवों के आधार पर हर कसौटी पर खरा उतरने का मूवमेंट मानता हूं। स्व से समझने का यही रास्ता है, अहम से वयम के कल्याण का यही रास्ता है। फ्रेंड्स, क्लाइमेट चेंज पर इस वैश्विक मंथन के बीच मैं भारत की ओर से इस चुनौती से निपटने के लिए 5 अमृत तत्व रखना चाहता हूं, पंचामृत की सौगात देना चाहता हूं। पहला, भारत 2030 तक अपनी नॉन फोसिल एनर्जी कैपेसिटी को 500 गीगावाट तक पहुंचाएगा। दूसरा, भारत 2030 तक अपनी 50% एनर्जी रिक्वायरमेंट्स रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी से पूरी करेगा। तीसरा, भारत अब से लेकर 2030 तक के कुल प्रोजेक्टेड कार्बन एमिशन में 1 बिलियन टन की कमी करेगा। चौथा, 2030 तक भारत अपनी अर्थव्यवस्था की कार्बन इंटेंसिटी को 45% से भी कम करेगा। और पांचवा, वर्ष 2070 तक भारत नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य हासिल करेगा। ये पंचामृत क्लाइमेट एक्शन में भारत का एक अभूतपूर्व योगदान होंगे। फ्रेंड्स, ये सच्चाई हम सभी जानते हैं कि क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस को लेकर आज तक किए गए वायदे खोखले ही साबित हुए हैं। जब हम सभी क्लाइमेट एक्शन पर अपने एम्बिशन बढ़ा रहे हैं, तब क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस पर विश्व के एम्बिशन वहीं नहीं रह सकते जो पेरिस एग्रीमेंट के समय थे। आज जब भारत ने एक नए कमिटमेंट और एक नई ऊर्जा के साथ आगे बढ़ने का संकल्प लिया है, तो ऐसे समय में क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस और लो कॉस्ट क्लाइमेट टेक्नोलॉजीज का ट्रांसफर और महत्वपूर्ण हो जाता है। भारत की अपेक्षा है कि विकसित देश जल्द से जल्द $1 ट्रिलियन का क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस उपलब्ध कराएं। आज आवश्यकता है कि जैसे हम क्लाइमेट मिटिगेशन में हुई प्रगति को ट्रैक करते हैं, वैसे ही हम क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस को भी ट्रैक करें। उचित न्याय तो ये होगा कि जो देश क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस पर किए अपने वादों पर खरे नहीं उतरे, उन पर दबाव बने। फ्रेंड्स, आज भारत क्लाइमेट के विषय पर बहुत ही साहस और बड़ी महत्वाकांक्षा के साथ आगे बढ़ रहा है। भारत अन्य सभी विकासशील देशों की पीड़ा भी समझता है, उन्हें साझा करता है और उनकी अपेक्षाओं की अभिव्यक्ति भी निरंतर करता रहेगा। कई विकासशील देशों के लिए क्लाइमेट चेंज उनके अस्तित्व पर मंडरा रहा है, एक बड़ा संकट है। हमें दुनिया को बचाने के लिए आज बड़े कदम उठाने ही होंगे। यही समय की मांग है और यही इस फोरम की प्रासंगिकता भी सिद्ध करेगा। मुझे विश्वास है कि ग्लासगो में लिए गए निर्णय हमारी भावी पीढ़ियों का भविष्य बचाएंगे और सुरक्षित और समृद्ध जीवन का उपहार देंगे। अध्यक्ष जी, मैंने समय अधिक लिया, आपसे मैं क्षमा चाहता हूं, लेकिन विकासशील देशों की आवाज उठाना ये मैं अपना कर्तव्य मानता हूं, इसलिए मैंने उस पर भी बल दिया है। मैं फिर एक बार आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूं।
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. There is cause for optimism as we gather here. 18 months ago, the world was staring into the abyss of a 1-in-100-year pandemic. The vaccines we would need had not only not been invented, but there had never been a vaccine for a coronavirus. But here we are, billions vaccinated, and the world is reclaiming what COVID has taken from us. The challenge of combating climate change will be met the same way, and it will be met by those who frankly are largely not in this room. It will be our scientists, our technologists, our engineers, our entrepreneurs, our industrialists and our financiers that will actually chart the path to net zero. And it is up to us as leaders of governments to back them in. Technology will have the answers to a decarbonised economy, particularly over time, and achieve it in a way that does not deny our citizens, especially in developing economies, their livelihoods or the opportunity for a better quality of life. Driving down the cost of technology and enabling it to be adopted at scale is at the core of the Australian way to reach our target of net zero emissions by 2050 that we are committing to at this COP26. Cleaner technology solutions must outcompete existing technologies if they are to be successful everywhere, and especially so in developing economies. This needs to work not just in the developed economies of the North Atlantic, but in the developing economies of the Indo-Pacific as well. Raising the cost of energy just impacts on those who can afford it least. Driving the emergence of low emissions technologies and fostering their widespread adoption is at the heart of our plan to reach net zero. And that's why we've set cost targets for clean hydrogen, low-cost solar, low-carbon steel and aluminium, energy storage, carbon capture and storage, and soil carbon. And we're not starting from scratch. 90% of commercial solar cells globally use Australian technology. Australia has the best rates of rooftop solar in the world. Our installation of renewables is 8 times faster than the global rate and 3 times faster than some of the most advanced economies in Europe. We have already reduced emissions in Australia by more than 20% since 2005, 54% as an emissions intensity measure, and over the same time our economy has grown by 45%, proving that economic growth and jobs is not at odds with emissions reduction. And by 2030, our national determined contribution here at COP26 notes that our emissions in Australia will fall by 35% by 2030, far exceeding our Paris commitment. Australia meets and beats our commitments, and we are doubling our initial climate finance commitment for our Pacific family and Southeast Asian partners to $2 billion committed here at COP26. Looking forward, we are forging technology partnerships domestically and abroad with Singapore, Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Korea and Indonesia, and we are close to concluding one with India. Australia is investing over $20 billion over the next decade to drive the transition, leveraging private sector investment to reach $80 billion in total. We are also working to establish high-integrity offsets internationally, working with our close friends and neighbours in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. The scene is set, global momentum to tackle climate change is building. Countries with net zero commitments cover over 80% of the world GDP. In Australia's case, 90% of our exports are to countries with net zero commitments. Our researchers, scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, and most importantly, our people are ready. The Australian way is to bet on them, and we think that's a good bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Alexander Schallenberg, Federal Chancellor of Austria. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address this distinguished group here today. My thanks goes to Prime Minister Boris Johnson for convening us all here at this critical point in time for this critical purpose. Our world is still in a state of emergency, and if the past 18 months of COVID pandemic has reminded us of one thing, then that it is in order to manage a global crisis effectively, we have to act fast and we have to act together. The same goes for a fight against climate change, and I can assure you that Austria is determined to play its part together with our partners in Europe and worldwide. Domestically in Austria, we're aiming at reaching net zero by 2040. With this ambitious goal in mind, we strongly focus on the use of renewables. Currently, we cover over 70% of our national electricity needs from renewable energy sources. Our goal is to bring this up to 100% by 2030. And we intend to achieve this milestone without using nuclear energy, because we don't believe that this is a sustainable or safe energy source. Another domestic priority for us is carbon pricing. We have just agreed a large-scale ecological turnaround as part of an eco-social tax reform. With this tax reform, we lay the foundation for a certificate-based carbon pricing scheme in Austria. And finally, we are investing more in public transportation and energy efficiency than ever before in our history. These domestic activities go obviously hand in hand with our cooperation at EU and at international level. We wholeheartedly support the European Union's ambitious climate goals. With them, Europe is truly setting an example, and it is on track to becoming the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. We also fully support the EU's role as one of the world's leading contributor of climate finance. As Austria, we have recently increased our contribution to the Green Climate Fund by 100 million euros, bringing it to a total of 130 million. However, ladies and gentlemen, we have to be aware of one fact. Despite all our efforts across all government levels, be it national, regional or local, we will fall short of our targets if we do not ensure the closest possible cooperation with the private sector. Because radical reductions in carbon emissions can only succeed through cooperation and innovation. Of course, every one of us, as individuals, as families, as societies, has a role to play to reduce his own carbon footprint. But unless we change everything we do, we have to rely on new ways of doing. Only new, sustainable forms of industrial production, of transport technology, of consumption, of housing, of forest management, to just name a few of them, will enable us to become fully climate neutral. These necessary innovations, I'm convinced, can only come from the closest possible cooperation with the private sector, from scientists, entrepreneurs, or others alike. And it is our task as political leaders to enable this cooperation, to support it wherever we can. This is critical in my opinion, because if we fail to do so, we would risk a situation in which we had to choose one day between the economic health of our nations or the environmental health of our planet. And I'm sure that you will all agree with me that neither of them is an option. Ladies and gentlemen, the protection of our climate and our planet is one of our generation's most important challenges, a challenge that we need to live up to with determination, innovation, and global cooperation. We, as Austria, stand ready to work alongside all of you in the years to come to live up to this task which history has placed upon us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, this summer in the south of my country, in the Netherlands, I stood on the bank of the Maas River, which was threatened by flooding caused by extreme rainfall. It was a terrifying sight. There, the dikes held. But elsewhere, in the province and across the border in Belgium and in Germany, raging torrents caused devastation. This is only one sad example that illustrates today's reality. More and more people worldwide are being impacted by climate change. It's serious, and it calls for serious action. First, we need further binding global commitments and concrete measures to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. For example, reducing harmful emissions to net zero, delivering a sustainable energy transition that offers new opportunities, and investing in a circular economy. COP26 can and must make real progress on these points. But we have to face reality. Climate change is already having lasting effects. So climate resilience must be our motto, climate adaptation our common endeavor. The King of the Netherlands has been battling the elements for centuries. From North Sea floods to Caribbean storms. Adaptation is in our DNA. That's why we hosted the Climate Adaptation Summit earlier this year. And we will co-host with Tajikistan the UN 2023 Water Decade Conference. Studies show that investing in adaptation and resilience works, because climate-proofing cities, farming and infrastructure protects livelihoods and ensures economic continuity. And innovative nature-based solutions and sustainable business models create new jobs and create new economic opportunities. For the most vulnerable communities, adaptation funds are often in short supply. And that is why we need to support each other. More than half of our kingdom's public climate financing goes to adaptation. And it's made up almost entirely of grant funding. And we hope that more countries will follow suit. Because climate mitigation and adaptation are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And with that principle as our guide, we have to take action. Timely, firm, and concerted action. As I said during yesterday's G20 in Rome, it should now be about action, action, action. Implementation, implementation, implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, you can count on the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And we are counting on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Askar Mamin, Prime Minister of Kazakhstan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, only 6 years ago, the Paris Agreement marked a turning point in the international climate policy discourse. It's my great pleasure to note that Kazakhstan was one of the first countries to ratify the document. In the updated nationally determined contribution, we have reaffirmed our commitment to unconditionally reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 15% by 2030. To fulfill its international obligations, Kazakhstan has adopted major upgrades to its national legislature. The new environmental code will drive comprehensive adaptation of green technology in practically every sector of the national economy and expand its capacity to face future climate-related challenges. Our commitments in respect of the NDCs include five-fold expansion in the volume of energy produced from renewables from 3 to 15%, doubling the amount of energy produced from environmentally friendly sources from 20 to 40, expanding the national carbon absorption capacity by planting more than 2 billion trees, and 30 percentage point reduction in the share of energy generated from coal, from 70 to 40. I am also delighted to inform you that, as announced at the 2020 Climate Ambition Summit, Kazakhstan is in the process of finalizing long-term strategy to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2060. The strategy targets unprecedented reductions in emissions through the series of focused interventions aimed at promoting the sustainable use of land and water, energy efficiency, electrification, and the large-scale use of eco-friendly and renewable energy sources, among others. Given the capital intensity of an effort of such a magnitude, our approach to decarbonization will focus on maximizing the use of market mechanisms and private investment. Of course, our effort on advancing the global climate change agenda will not be limited by our geographical borders and the commitments we made in Paris. Given Kazakhstan's ambition to serve as a Central Asia driving force of the sustainable environment agenda, we stand ready to serve as a hub to unite regional efforts towards achieving green growth. Kazakhstan's Climate Hub for Sustainable Development will act to facilitate technology transfer, attract green finance, and share knowledge. In addition, given Kazakhstan's capacity to produce and process rare earth elements, we stand ready to contribute to advancing global supply chains, which play a critical role in accelerating the world's transition to clean energy. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are all emerging from the pandemic, I believe this conference is crucial to set in place an urgent, effective and human-based transition to a global green economy. Such transition must ensure to both preserve the planet and protect the people that inhabit it. It must also make sure that financial burdens are shouldered fairly among people and among countries. Despite the many obstacles we are all facing in this challenging path, let me conclude by reaffirming that Kazakhstan remains strongly committed to the implementation of the global climate change agenda. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Aziz Akhanouch, Prime Minister of Morocco. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci. يسعدني أن أتناول الكلمة أمام جمعكم الموقر باسم صاحب الجلالة الملك محمد السادس حفظه الله. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على مولانا رسول الله وآله وصحبه. السيد الرئيس، أصحاب الفخامة ورؤساء الدول والحكومات، السيد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة. نود أن نهنئ المملكة المتحدة على جهودها لإنجاح تنظيم ورئاسة الدورة 26 لمؤتمر الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن تغيير المناخ، وهي مناسبة لتقوية التزامنا الجماعي بمكافحة المخاطر الكبيرة التي تهدد مستقبل البشرية. فمع تواتر تقارير خبراء المناخ، ويتأكد للجميع أن التوقعات الأكثر قتامة أصبحت واقعاً مريراً يضع البشرية أمام خيارين: إما الاستسلام للتقاعس المدمر للذات، أو الانخراط بصدق وعزيمة في إجراءات عملية وسريعة قادرة على إحداث تغيير حقيقي في المسار الحالي الذي أثبت عدم فعاليته. وقد كشفت الاستجابة العالمية لتهديد وباء كوفيد-19 عن مقومات كانت توصف بغير المتاحة لدعم مكافحة التغيرات المناخية، حيث تمكنت مجموعة من الدول التي تقع على عاتقها المسؤولية التاريخية والأخلاقية عن تدهور الوضع البيئي الحالي من تخصيص موارد تمويلية هائلة، كما أبانت أن تخفيف أنشطتها المضرة بالمناخ والبيئة ممكن دون أن يكون لذلك نتائج لا يمكن تحملها. فالأكيد أننا في حاجة ملحة لإرادة سياسية حقيقية والتزام أكثر إنصاف تجاه فئة واسعة من البشرية تتحمل تبعات نظام اقتصادي عالمي لا تستفيد بشكل عادل من منافعه، فضعف التمويل والدعم التكنولوجي بالنظر للضرر المناخي الذي تتحمله إفريقيا هو تجسيد صارخ لقصور المنظومة الدولية الحالية. سيد الرئيس، إننا نأمل أن تتمكن هذه الدورة من تحفيز ذكاء جماعي عالمي يؤسس لمجتمع إنساني مستدام ومتضامن يعلي قيم الإنصاف والعيش المشترك. وانطلاقاً من هذه القناعة الراسخة يعزز المغرب التزامه متعدد الأبعاد بقضايا المناخ من خلال رفع طموح مساهمته المحددة وطنياً لتخفيض غازات الاحتباس الحراري بنسبة 45.5 بحلول 2030، وذلك ضمن استراتيجية متكاملة لتنمية منخفضة الكربون في أفق 2050 تهدف إلى الانتقال إلى اقتصاد أخضر ينسجم مع أهداف الاستدامة وتعزيز قدرة الصمود والتكيف وحماية البيئة التي يقوم عليها النموذج التنموي الجديد للمملكة. وبنفس العزم يعزز المغرب انخراطه إلى جانب البلدان الإفريقية الشقيقة لمواجهة التداعيات المدمرة للتغيرات المناخية من خلال المبادرات التي أطلقها للتكيف الزراعة والأمن والاستقرار والولوج إلى الطاقة المستدامة، وكذا اللجان المناخية الإفريقية الثلاث التي انبثقت عن قمة العمل الإفريقية المنعقدة في نوفمبر 2016 بمراكش. السيد الرئيس، لقد أصبحت التغييرات الواجب اتخاذها للحد من استفحال تداعيات أزمة المناخ معروفة، ولا يمكن للمجتمع الدولي أن يظل متردداً، بل يجب المضي قدما لتفعيل حلول ملموسة بأجندة تنفيذ محدد مدعومة بإرادة سياسية قوية لتغيير المسار المقلق التي يتجه إليه العالم. وإننا ندعو إلى صحوة الضمير العالمي وإلى الالتزام الجماعي والمسؤول لمواجهة التغيرات المناخية من أجل مستقبل أفضل للبشرية جمعاء. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Distinguished heads of state and government, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, this brings us to the end of our national statements in this plenary for today. We will continue with the delivery of national statements tomorrow at 10:00 hours in plenary Cairngorm. Now that we have finished the high-level segment for today, we will have a short interval with leading non-state actor voices on stage. I would now like to welcome Nigel Topping, UN High-Level Climate Champion for COP26, Yikse Bastida, Youth Climate Leader, and Mayor Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles and C40 Chair on the theme of mitigation and collaboration.
Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to take this opportunity for a moment of reflection. Many of us were gathered in Le Bourget in Paris in 2015 when you, the parties, invited non-state actors into a dynamic partnership to drive forward climate action and created the role of high-level champion to guide this work. 6 years since the gavel came down, we have achieved something that was far from certain then. Non-state actors in the global economy have now reached consensus on the science and are actively working towards halving emissions this decade in order to be on track to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. Working with my Chilean colleague Gonzalo Munoz and hundreds of Marrakesh partners, we have seen extraordinary momentum building under the Race to Zero. Today, representing nearly 8,000 organizations, over 5,000 businesses, 67 regions, over 1,000 cities, 400 financial institutions, and over 1,000 universities and 50 healthcare institutions, all committed to the short-term actions necessary to play their part in halving emissions this decade, all responding to the calls from citizens of the world, all in service of supporting parties in implementing the Paris Agreement. But of course, we're not where we need to be, as the latest IPCC and ND synthesis reports make clear. That's why we call it the Race to Zero. Indeed, to keep 1.5 degrees alive, we need to cut global emissions 5 times faster than we have over the last 10 years, which makes this the decisive decade, the decade to deliver on the promise of Paris and the prospect of a better, safer, fairer, healthier world for everyone. The scale of this task is vast, but what inspires confidence is that now we have clarity over what we have to do, and we are building the momentum to deliver it. Despite the global pandemic, we've seen this unprecedented ramp-up of momentum with more than 20% of the major businesses in 18 of 30 global sectors now in the race to zero. And these ambition breakthroughs point to the potential for 2030 outcome breakthroughs evidenced in the real economy, whether it's renewable energy growing faster and cheaper than any form of electricity in history, or world's car makers converging on phasing to 100% electric vehicles by 2035, or billions of investment in heavy industry, shipping, aviation, steel, cement, and green hydrogen for a net zero economy, all driven by an unprecedented pivot in the scale of commitment in private finance. Working with Mark Carney and the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, the Race to Zero has now over $100 trillion of capital aligned with the climate science, with a particular focus on deploying in emerging markets. All this was unimaginable in Paris, much of it even 12 months ago. But now we can see the transition is technologically achievable, economically attractive, and it will deliver much greater prosperity all around the world than we have today. Working arm in arm with governments, the dynamism of the real economy, of businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, is demonstrating that all actors can step up their ambitious plans every single year. But this is not just an economic story. We also need a race to resilience. This is a human story touching all of us, the lives of our neighbours, our families and our children. So to explore these other dimensions, I'm honoured to welcome our next two speakers, Shia Bastida, climate justice activist, and then C40 Cities Chair, Mayor Eric Garcetti. Shia, over to you.
Honorable heads of state and present delegates, my name is Shia Bastida, and I am a climate justice activist from Mexico. Firstly, as I speak, please keep in mind what you heard from my friend Elizabeth Withuti about opening our hearts. Today, I want to talk about the climate crisis being a generational injustice. When we talk about the impacts of the climate crisis on future generations, we speak on them as if those generations were not here, but we are present. By 2050, I will be 48 years old. And when I look out of the window, I will see the world you are negotiating right now. What will that Earth look like? If we were to stop emissions right now, we would leave the world with an increase of 1.1 degrees of warming, which is already causing immense damage in the form of floods, wildfires, hurricanes, biodiversity loss, forced migration, and more. In my home country, Mexico, there is an increase in the intensity of droughts and tropical storms, which are themselves exacerbating present injustices. And instead of trying to fix the damage prior generations have caused, we are adding to harm every day we fail to act, which represents a deep ethical immorality, an immorality of disconnect with the place we call home. Up to 475 million more people would be affected by climate-related risks if we get to 2 degrees of warming instead of 1.5. And even if we stay at 1.5 degrees, 4.5 billion people will be exposed to heat waves and water stress. This is my second conference of the parties. You have been doing this for longer than I've been alive. I have a simple question. How many more COPs are you going to have before we take action? We know exactly what needs to be done, and it starts by opening our hearts and our spirits. Here are some of the demands that youth have put together. We need to keep and reach the goal of 1.5 degrees by setting goals for drastic emissions reductions, starting with the richest countries. We need to collectively divest from fossil fuels and stop new fossil fuel infrastructure. According to the International Monetary Fund, governments gave up to $5.2 trillion to fossil fuel subsidies in 2019. We need to stop relying on carbon offsets as a way to counter emissions. We need to deliver the $100 billion promise to the most vulnerable nations, a number that should be 140 to 300 billion starting in 2025. We need to ensure a just transition to renewable energy in which workers' rights are upheld. Together, we must end the political, economic, and social influence of the fossil fuel industry in decision-making while holding them accountable for spreading climate misinformation. We must protect indigenous people's rights to care for their land, namely the 80% of biodiversity that is protected under their stewardship. I would like to invite everyone here to connect on a personal level to the following statement. I am in a critical moment in history in which I have a stake in the future of the planet. I will be respectful and responsible enough to listen to the generations of the future and to the best available science, and do everything in my power to leave this world better than I found it. Starting by committing to have my country do the most to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming while centering justice and the protection of frontline communities. Thank you. Before I leave, I would like to introduce Chair and C40 Cities Mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti. Thank you.
Gracias, Xie, por la introducción. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the United Nations, to our hosts, the United Kingdom and Italy, and every leader who is here in Glasgow. I'm Eric Garcetti, the chair of C40 Cities and mayor of Los Angeles. And this is the speech you've been waiting for, the final speech of the day. But I come not just as the last speaker, but with a message that I hope inspires you. Because at a time of immense worry, I come here with a message of intense hope. The unified voice of the world's cities who say that we can, we must, and we will deliver. In 2019, my peers elected me to chair C40, a global network of mayors who committed then to making the 2020s the climate decade, a decade of action. 2 years later, it's very clear that this needs to be a decade of exponential action. But cities are leading the way to save our planet, to invest in our people, and to leave no one behind. And we are testament to 3 facts. 1, that we are on the front lines. It is our residents who are fleeing fires, our residents who are fleeing floods, grappling with drought and heat. 2, we know how to fix it. Cities aren't just laboratories of progress. We are the factories of the future, transforming how we heat and cool our buildings, move around our cities, and generate our electricity. And 3rd, we are getting it done. 2/3 of C40 cities have set and met targets that meet or exceed the Paris commitments on time or early. You see, we can inspire national climate action and ambition to show what's possible. If you don't think you can have fully electric bus fleet, go to Shenzhen and see it. Or clean up your central district in an ultra-low emission zone, go to London and experience it. And if you don't think that a city is on its way to 100% renewable power, I invite you to Los Angeles, where we will be 97% carbon-free by the end of this decade. This progress is meaningful, but let's be honest, at the end of this day, it is still not enough, which is why we launched the Cities Race to Zero, a partnership of C40, CDP, Global Covenant of Mayors, ICLEI, UCLG, WWF, and the World Resources Institute. And tonight, my friends, I am proud to announce the biggest pledge at COP outside of our national commitments, that Cities Race to Zero has produced a global coalition of over 1,000 cities and local governments, representing 722 million people, more than a quarter of the world's GDP, committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and cutting their fair share, our fair share of global emissions in half by 2030. And the UN says that our collective action has the potential to reduce global emissions by at least 1.4 gigatons by 2030 annually. That's like taking a country bigger than the fifth country and cutting out our emissions altogether. From Kinshasa to Heidelberg, Salvador to Osaka, cities are keeping 1.5 degrees alive. In conclusion, our people are counting on us. Our world needs hope. The future of our planet depends on us. So let's summon the courage to make this the decade of exponential action and implementing a global Green New Deal. The poet Robert Browning said, "Our reach must always exceed our grasp. After all, what's a heaven for?" And my friends at the COP, I would say our reach must exceed our grasp. After all, what is this COP for? Distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our interlude. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Nigel Topping, Shi Bastida, and Mayor Eric Garcetti, and my friend Gonzalo, who's walking away there, and thank you very much for your contributions and on the theme of mitigation and collaboration, although you have spoken at a relatively empty room, but we'll make sure your messages are conveyed far and wide. This concludes the session for today, and we look forward to welcome you back tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, we should, yeah. Can you get the filter them into that? Okay.